So we look at the character and meanings of Nei. As I had mentioned, the first thing to be aware of is it implies what's below the obvious. It's below what you can see. It's definitely below what anyone could see, because for the most part, in neigong practice, we might be doing some subtle movements at the beginning when we're seated, but at a certain point, we go into an immersive stillness and then all of the inner work, the Nei Gong. But we want to just begin that conversation by saying, okay, what is Nei? Okay. Well, if I'm going to sit on the inside and, face what it is on the inside, that really is up to the inside. So depending on how much visceral um, uh, conditioning you've had, say around abusive relationships, trauma, bad parenting and stuff like that, what you're going to be facing on the inside is that inner turmoil at first, the butterflies in your stomach. But when we sit in that idea that we can find solace, you can't find solace away from the fact that you're feeling restless. You have to move through the restlessness to get to the rest, right? So we want to have that, um, I guess, honest relationship with neigong and the recognition that we have to be in our embodied state that's conditioned to get below it, to get to an embodied state that is, you might say, implicit to being alive, to be an animal, to be in the moment. And in order to go through that, we need skills to self-regulate, to down-regulate, to shift the memories around a little bit that might be held in the body below consciousness in a way. Something that happens in the boundary between doing things that you can talk about and things that you can't really make sense of in words asks us to really trust some things um, within the nature of us as conscious beings, for sure. Um, but it also brings up this idea of a liminal state or a transformational state. And I'll give you a very quick example of what that would look like. So imagine you're afraid of heights and you want to dive into a swimming pool to get over heights, and you're going to walk up the ladder to the diving board and get ready to jump off the diving board. Now, this is sort of true, and I'm sort of exaggerating a point, but the one standing on the diving board, terrified of the heights and terrified of the jumping, is not going to be the one who jumps. The one who jumps off the diving board is the one who's willing to risk the consequences of doing that to find out who they are after the leaping, the falling, the swimming, and maybe doing it 10 more times because it was really fun. And there's that falling into and jumping into the unknown, moving beyond the perhaps fear of heights and jumping into pools of water or something that we all are going to need to do. And that's where a lot of these practices and principles and things come into uh, you know, our toolbox, things we need to have as gong on the inside, which is a big part of what neigong practice is to study all of that stuff so that we actually can leap over and over again, through that liminal part of our, conscious sense of being so that we can move beyond egoic self, beyond structured identities and things like that. So when we look at the character in there, it's basically the picture of a person inside of something. It could be a dwelling or something like that. Or it could even be a sense of a person on the inside of the metaphor of moving through a doorway or a gateway beyond. So what's on one side of the gateway and then on the other side of the gateway are different. So that there's also that idea of moving through, like I was talking about, jumping off the diving board. So other ways of looking at that would be to just look inward. So take a moment and how are your butterflies? Do you have any? Or are they pterodactyls? And so that's, the first implication is just looking within, feeling within, listening within, sensing into what's actually coming into our present experience that we're not doing to ourselves, but that sort of seems to be echoing through ourselves in that way. In say the martial arts context, it could be moving from your center, which is sort of a cross of connective tissue between your rib cage and your knees, including all the dynamic movement of your pelvis to move from center. In that sense, we can say moving from center in the mechanical sense can also describe how we learn to generate power from the inside. But it can also imply that when we're interacting with people, we're deciding to get really centered into our true authentic self before we respond to people. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, so on either side of this, but let's say there's two people having a conversation, and it's going to be a bit of a contentious conversation. So one of the people says, just give me a second. I just want to get centered before I respond to that question or respond to that insult or, that passive aggressive nudge or something. And that's just a part of being alive is I just need a minute to get centered. So I'm not reacting to your reaction to your childhood or my childhood or whatever. I want to speak to you from a place that's at least hopefully more aware, more competent, more calm in that sense. They also can mean kind of just below the surface. And let's say that there's infinite surfaces, almost like we have infinite membranes in the body. And no matter where we get to, there's always going to be another layer on the inside. And this is something that you can see in the kind of fractal shamanic world of, there's the same scale from galaxies to solar systems to atoms. Like there's sort of a regressing uh, frame of reference that is always going to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. So that's another way to look at the idea of Gong is, well, how deep does the rabbit hole go in the sense of, I don't know, it's that movie with red pills and blue pills. So there's that. There's another example that I like to give just because a lot of people interested in neigong and things like that have a martial arts background. And I've been watching this argument play out for about 40 years, and that means before the internet. So we had to read articles and then write articles to communicate with each other across the world about what we think we mean about these things. But we often talk about the idea of external martial arts and internal martial arts, and people tearing apart the meaning of those two things. But what I usually speak to in that context is the difference between obvious and subtle. So in a martial arts context, if I see someone standing there punching a board over and over again, and eventually breaking it or something, what they're doing is pretty obvious. Why they're doing it is pretty obvious. Like you're punching really hard and you're punching hard things until you're harder than hard things. There's pretty much one application for that in the world, which is, well, besides the discipline and the training and hopefully not too much surgery, um, the ability to punch things hard, it's obvious, right? And that's kind of the idea of external. When you look at internal martial arts, and that's the, kind of the terms we use nowadays, like Tai Chi and all the other internal martial arts, and even I Chuan, which hardly even has a lot of outside movement. What the person's doing, if you're watching them, we just watched a guy punching a board. Now we're going to watch a person move around like they're sneaking up on a tree, or not even move at all, but like, just maybe rotate their arms back and forth or something. What they're doing and why they're doing it is not obvious. It's very subtle. And unless they explain to you what they're doing and why they're doing it and how that relates to martial arts, you may or may not agree that it has any value. And we see that more and more today. So another way to look at it would be below your identity. Like, who is the one meditating? Well, there's the story you, and there's the state of you. And Nei Gong really asks us to kind of keep convincing the story person that the state is the real story. Kind of like going from your left brain to your right brain over and over and over and over, and over again. Because we're going to get below the identity, because there is maybe no who meditating in one sense. Then there's a bit of esoteric stuff which we talk about being hidden from the mundane. Right? We have mundane life, and then we have the sort of sacredness of life. There's mundane practices that might help you avoid IBS, and then there's things that might elicit over time the formation of an actual coherent Dantian and all of the things that go with that. And no one can see that, and most people in modern life wouldn't even care about that because it's on the kind of, if there's a teeter-totter, it's trying to move towards the sacred, whereas most of us nowadays have no idea what that's about. And we're very invested in the mundane, so we can pick sides in the mundane and be right about stuff and all of that. So the first line in the Tao Te Ching, I'm just going to suddenly change context a bit, is Dao Ke Dao Fei Chang Dao. which means if you can talk about it or explain it or put it into kind of causal frames of reference, that's not the Tao. And that describes what we mean by the term apathetic meditation. Now, in modern English, that term often describes a really specific thing around Western meditation and in the context of Christianity and God. So I'm not using apathetic in the Western sense primarily, because the word apathetic means that it's not observable or knowable with a conditioned mind. So the one that is still you trying to better you can't experience what it is that's apathetic or apophosis or those terms, which is the realization that what's really going on here is beneath the mind or before the mind or the wizard behind the curtain in the Wizard of Oz. And that's a big part of why we're going to learn all this stuff is so that our meditation can go from externally embodied, training so that you can sit for a long time to reorienting all the different ways you sit and breathe so that you can sit still enough, long enough to enter into apathetic state of it's beyond anything I can do. How do I sit as a self beyond the self or a non-self or what you might call Wu Wei experience? And if you've got all that figured out and you're already there, you don't need to study Nei Gong. You're, this close to enlightenment. So yay. The rest of this is probably going to be just distracting. If you feel that you might need a little sort of traditional support that goes back thousands of years about how to undo conditioning, especially nowadays with audience consciousness and simulation addiction, that's what this course is going to be about, is how to unravel identity structures through the meridian system, the Dantian system, what are called the six minds, and kind of the more subtle meridians of the body. So that's what that's all about. Although there is one other thing that I sometimes talk about is the character Nei, the character for Nei, someone within something, also kind of implies that we're moving through that liminal boundary, but specifically from the separate self out there in the world doing itself to whatever it is that's coming through all of us in the sense of non-separation. What people might call the collective unconscious or the collective experiencing now, or what some people say, if I get this right, you're a spiritual being having a human experience. So below that separate human experience, we're all the same experience in one sense, right? So as we learn Neigong, we have to work through what it is that's disordered, dysregulated, or distorted in our meridians. If we want to return to that hunter-gatherer mindset or experience of beingness as the land for the land in our practice, especially our Qigong practice, being very aware of what the seasons are and the flow of them is helpful. And we all kind of know that. But as we go through the Neigong process, we're going to talk about the way the indigenous calendar of Asia and North America, which is almost the same, goes through every season, which is about every 15 days, give or take a couple of days. There's a tangible shift in season. So we're going to touch in with that throughout the time we go through the course so that we can all learn to feel into and have a tangible relationship with the nature of nature, which has a lot to do with the nature of what we are because we evolved in nature. That's like the four directions, the five elements, and all of that stuff. It's a big part of Taoist practice. We also are going to have to encounter and move through and beyond what it is our instinctual and intuitive self are. And that's why when I first started talking about this, I was talking about how when you flinch, you're 2/10 of a second behind the world and have to catch up. When you're having an intuitive sense that something isn't right, you're 1/10 of a second, kind of ahead of the world, but you're not present in the world. So we're going to need to go through and deconstruct the way our instinctual self has embodied everything that's happened to us and how our intuitive, what we call polyvagal self, kind of reads into and kind of manipulates the world with our own body language and tone of voice and things like that. So we want to deconstruct all of those things so that as we move towards an awareness of our energy centers and gateways and all of interactive possibilities that are a part of the practice, we're moving in there by undoing the doing, undoing the unconscious, bringing the unconscious into consciousness so that we can feel the more innate conscious aspects of our nature and notice if they're disoriented, we can return the disorientation to the innate. And we do this with what are called the 6 innate minds or the 6 pain bodies, which again, in this tradition of neigong Taoist practice, Yidao Huan Yuan practice, is a tradition that is sort of clinically oriented. So when we think of innate minds, we are also aware that we have conditioned minds and that we can heal the disordered or disoriented self to reorient ourselves to those innate aspects of consciousness so that we at least have a roadmap for what consciousness is doing below the conditioned self. So we can sneak in, you could say, behind that curtain over and over again until that becomes what we remember ourselves as being, the unconditioned innate self instead of the conditioned self.